Hey students, welcome to lab number 20, in which case we're going to be talking about tone and civil discourse in the psychological sciences. Now for your assignments today, you were supposed to watch the Amy Cuddy video on power poses, as well as read the New York Times article that talks about social psychological sciences and the battle between Amy Cuddy and other social scientists who exclaimed her of having p-hacking and having bad methods, and kind of some of the critiques and civil discourse that happen from the Amy Cuddy talks. Now, normally we would be having a discussion during this part of the class to talk about what happened in these videos, this video, as well as seeing how the discourse did and getting some of our opinions. However, in place of that, we have a discussion board that hopefully you have. I've already seen a few responses, but if you're watching this video and you haven't done the discussion board yet, please go and do the discussion board first before watching the rest of the lab. So in the New York Times article that you read, that was talking about the debate between Amy Cuddy and Simmons and Gelman, who was also mentioned in the article, about their responses to Amy Cuddy's work. There was a lot in there indicating that Amy Cuddy was in fact bullied and criticized to a higher degree than may have been needed. However, I posted on the slideshow a couple examples of the responses. Normally in the class we would go and actually read through these. However, what I would like you to do is actually take the time to read through them yourself. Gather some opinions on what you think were these actual responses very bullying worthy, or were they just standard critiques? Normally we would just read through it and have the class kind of discussion about it. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, go ahead and pause the video at this point, go ahead and read the articles and kind of develop your own opinions, and then come back into the video and come back. Now, if you pause the video and proceeded on, then I can kind of tell you my response to this is that really what I found from reading these articles is that I didn't think these were necessarily huge cases of bullying of Amy Cuddy. These actually seemed more scientific critiques, in which case they actually indicated through data and replicated studies that this is the difference between your study and our replicated studies, and that there was some indication of, whether intentional or not, of some sort of questionable research practices overall. So go ahead and read through these actual responses and develop an opinion of whether you think that she was actually bullied or not. So after reading through those articles, maybe you can have a better sense, rather than the actual New York Times article, which made the claims of Amy Cuddy's response, in which case she indicated that she was bullied from the scientific process of Simone and colleagues, in which Simone was super critical of her. You are able to kind of form your own opinions about their responses to her studies. Oftentimes we kind of found that this was actually more of a well-reasoned article, and was more of a scientific critique and not an attack, but more reasonable and understandable towards her. Even though Amy Cuddy felt like these were more critical attacks and criticisms towards her, that may have felt like more cyberbullying. In fact, there was a lot of arguments saying that, because she was a woman, it was oftentimes felt that she was being cyberbullied specifically because she is a woman. However, that's a little bit aside from the point. The criticism is that this is important to cite it. The point is that this criticism, it is important to scientific progress and to scientific rigor. However, we need to kind of debate about how are we able to have this tone and civil discourse in science to criticize other scientists, especially in the field of social psychology, in which case we're now getting into replicating studies, in order to do this without this being actual bullying. So now I'd like to go and talk about another instance in which this attack happened apart from Amy Cuddy, in which case this happened with Simone Schnall at Cambridge University, in which her and her colleagues had a study with two experiments that measured the effects of people's thoughts or feelings of cleanliness on the harshness of their moral judgments. The study was failed to replicate with a larger sample. And what ended up happening is that this Simone Schnall, who had her study fail to replicate, actually agreed to be a reviewer for the registered reports that were replications of her studies, as to serve as a commentator and to help and understand what was going on with the failed replications. However, the authors, when they were blogging and when they were helping her out, eventually she felt that she was pushed out and then not provided the opportunity to even write responses to why her studies were failing to replicate, even though it had been promised to her by the original authors that this would be a part of her role. They failed to allow her to give her that opportunity. So from this, Simone Schnall felt that she was defamed and treated like a criminal suspect and no right to defense, with no way to win. So she said, similar to Amy Cuddy's point, that she was being bullied as well, and other people supported her and to combat the replicators, saying that they were bullies and they were not and they were not allowing her to cooperate in the way that she was, and saying that her work was bad. So eventually the replicators apologized for implying that her work was bad, but for too long this discussion continued to focus on who chose the wrong words and who took the wrong tone, and what ended up happening. How are we able to fix this ability? How are we able to critique individuals in the scientific community without bullying them overall, in order to kind of encourage the scientific progress of failed to replicate studies and so on. And so I'd also like to indicate that the civility problem and problems with tone and discourse and scientific research goes more than beyond in just the public eye, in which the case of Amy Cuddy, where she was kind of publicly defamed and shown that her scientific process was wrong the whole time. This is really also an area within the peer review process, in which it's privately owned within researchers, where peer reviewers will oftentimes have really, really awful discourse and civility towards those that they're reviewing within the scientific research process. So it's oftentimes not just a matter of this public eye that sees this, but often within the field as well, where we're seeing a lot of tone and civil discourse problems in which civility is often lacking overall. So I'd like to turn the subject to talking about why civility even matters in the replicability discourse overall. You have to think about what we're doing in this replicability field, especially that social sciences and social psychology falls in with a lot of time now, where we're trying to replicate studies that have been previously done before. Right? So what we're doing in our field oftentimes is taking a study that's already been accomplished and questioning the methods, or seeing what parts of it were correct or incorrect, or are not holding up or are holding up in there. So we have to say, in the scientific community, especially when we're getting into the open science community, where things are available for everyone, social psychology should be conducted for free, everyone's data should be shared. Well, if we don't have civility and discourse and good discourse within the field, it's not likely that people are going to want to share those things and their materials and data and actually pre-register hypotheses like we've been talking about the whole time in this class, in order to create better science. So the first thing about civility is, we already know civility is inviting, right? So it's the surest way of accomplishing our goal that the open science community wants, right? To have this replication with a civil discourse between individuals, so that on both ends of the spectrum we can talk about what's being replicated, what's not being replicated. We want things to be warm, inviting, encouraging of people to make changes to the way they conduct their science. We don't want them to bludgeon the way through science with name calling, or professional threats or guilt trips and so forth within our field, right? So it's better to have this civility, to be inviting towards others, so that they will want to produce this work of replication. Next, by having this actual civil discussion and discourse, it leads to a focus on actual issues and doesn't distract from what's going on. It's not a matter of this name calling or who's better or what it is about these studies that leads to kind of this name bashing calling that was similar to that of Amy Cuddy, right? So I think that Amy Cuddy study was kind of this eye opener for the open science community to say, look, we need to be able to replicate studies without having a a mean interface between the two parties every single time. We need to be open with ourselves, and we need to actually focus on the actual issues, which is improving science and progressing science forward, by replicating studies, right? We need to be able to replicate studies while being civil. And really, overall, it's positive for both people on both ends. The one being part of the replication and the one that's being replicated, right? That way we can have this discussion about, okay, what is it about the study that ran? Why didn't it replicate? Was it because of something to do with power, or were the methodologies different? We need to have this open discussion between both parties. So let's dig a little bit deeper as to what civility is in the role of scientific discourse. So we always, of course, go to that classic Webster's Dictionary definition in which they define civility as polite, reasonable, and respectful behavior. But however, I think within the scientific community, growing consideration has kind of produced a more nuanced definition for what civil scientific discourse really is, right? So I think this definition is expanded to kind of honoring your personal values as well as listening to other points of view and being respectful towards that. So civility really transcends that of politeness, right? It goes beyond that. It's not just being polite, it's encompassing and pursuing shared ideas to reach some sort of common grounds that we want to focus on. So it's not just your ideas, it's understanding that other ideas exist out there. And providing this kind of prioritizing the civility that facilitates an effective communicative effort and creates high functioning teams, teams that are kind of on other sides of the spectrum, and creates an inclusive community for more civic engagement. So it really hasn't received too much attention in psychology. However, this idea of civility is not new to scientific research and has been in other fields of research already. But it's especially important in terms of social psychology. It's actually surprising to me that it's not a huge portion of social psychology research to talk about civil discourse, considering the kind of subjects that we touch on oftentimes that are political and get into kind of religious practices as well, that you think that civil discourse would have to be an essential piece of your field. The fact that it's kind of new is actually a bit surprising to me overall. But if we can improve the civility in the social psychology research and social psychology scientific rigor overall, we can develop a better community, especially when we're talking about in terms of the open science community to replicate studies overall. So, kind of the newest thing that's happened here is that in 2016, the American Psychological Association, otherwise known as APA, they actually initiated some sort of work group to develop more civility principles within the psychological community, which again isn't new to science overall, just a little bit newer to the psychological community that indicates that if you're a part of the American Psychological Association or some subdomain of psychology overall, you need to have a kind of more civil scientific discourse with each other and adhere to our guidelines of professionalism and recognizing other people's work. And continuing on with that of the APA guidelines of how they kind of promoted this civilness and scientific discourse in the social psychology realm, there's been other initiatives out there as well. I have linked here on the PowerPoint. We won't actually go to it because we're not live in class right now, but an actual initiative in which, it's signed by initiative that has been signed by over 700 people, designating their commitments towards being more civil in the scientific community and being mindful of other people's thoughts and research rather than bashing and name calling and all these other kind of bullying behaviors that Amy Cuddy may have been a part of. But kind of some of the things that are indicated within this initiative are, to watch the tone of the conversation. And I know that watch the tone of the conversation so that this can kind of get away from any misunderstandings. Now, I know that this is kind of one of the main points. It's not my favorite point in the world, but one of the things that they oftentimes want you to do is be careful about humor within your kind of scientific discourse. Any mocking or sarcasm or parody can kind of lead to misunderstandings within the scientific community. They're often insulting. Me as someone who I like to joke around a lot as well, this would be hard for me, but in the scientific discourse, I think it's kind of our responsibility to just keep it clear, straight on the science, you know, nothing of that sort. Additionally, another thing that they kind of want you to do when watching the tone of the conversation is avoiding any profanity or demographic slurs, which is fairly obvious, but these things need to be mentioned within there. And I'm sure, in scientific conferences and other kind of peer-reviewed articles, there have been very, very uncivil slurs that have happened in the past. So it's making this point that we can't have that within the scientific rigor if we're going to continue this. And then also, it's always important to differentiate between fact and anything else, right? And anything else. So, anything that's a speculation or an opinion needs to be clearly stated that this is an opinion and not a fact of some sort. If it is a fact, you need to provide some sort of justification for that fact. This can be through a citation, some sort of website. Just because something says something verbally or even on a website or something like that, it's not necessarily true. And then the next thing, the very last one that we're going to cover here is to stay on topic when you're in your scientific discourse. So it's kind of interesting because a lot of times where we can do is we can start from this one range of kind of one very specific topic in which we're talking about someone's scientific study and giving them critique. However, you need to stay on topic within that critique and not go beyond that of the critique that you're doing and making it more personal. Making it more personal leads to this kind of other culture that we're not really inclined to having within the social psychology community, and which will lead to kind of less ability to replicate studies and less ability to share data because of this scientific culture that would be built off of incivility. So what we're searching for is for us to always watch the tone of the conversation, avoid any sweeping generalizations, differentiate between fact or any sort of opinion. Anything that you say, you need to back it up with a citation or some sort of peer-reviewed article, have some sort of credibility for what you're saying. And then lastly, staying on topic, not veering beyond that of the article. It doesn't even need to get personal towards the author itself, but rather just talking about the article overall. So now let's bring it all over to us. How can we be more civil? I really think that these are kind of pretty obvious things that I think can apply to everyday life and don't necessarily need to be necessarily associated with you and your scientific discourse solely. I think this is overall. But overall, when being part of scientific discourse overall, be mindful of your own behavior. How are you creating a welcoming environment for differing opinions, especially in that of those if you're in your future choosing to replicate studies? It's important, especially in terms of going to some sort of scientific conference, in which case we oftentimes share our overall ideas. You don't interrupt in conversations that are associated with scientific research and opinions and facts being said. And listen for content of what is being said, not how it's being said. Just because someone is saying something more aggressively or in a different tone, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're more right than the other. Look at what's being said. And like I said, I think this is should be related to normal everyday life as well. And then lastly, finding common ground between you and other researchers as you have a talk about scientific research and literature and differing ideas. And this is just another list of things, it's not always you that's being reprimanded for being civil or not civil, right? It could be the person talking to you. What if they're not being civil to you? I think, again, this relates to kind of everyday life and not just overall discourse. This is something that I would try anytime with somebody. But, if somebody is not being civil towards you and your literature, respectfully asking for the evidence that supports the statements that they're making, and you, of course, using evidence to support the statements that you've made. Staying calm, I think, is always a good advice, and taking a break from the conversation if things are getting too heated. telling your opponent that you don't know how to interpret his or her facial expressions, ask them for help in understanding what they mean, getting more clarification. I think miscommunication is often, a big part of this. People may not think that they're being uncivil to you, but of course it might seem that way. Um, additionally, especially if you've been interrupted in some point with when having some sort of scientific discourse with somebody, or at a conference when you're speaking and somebody interrupts you, ask for equal time, or using a polite tone to say something like, "May I finish my point? Um, all right, I wasn't quite finished yet. May I continue?" And then, of course, expressing your understanding. These are kind of basic general ways of listening. It's more of an active listening approach, but expressing your understanding, saying things like "I understand" or "I hear you" when someone is having some sort of uncivil scientific discussion with you in your field. So to just kind of end off this kind of shorter lecture, because like I said, oftentimes is about to be us, watching videos in class and having some sort of discussion based on the content that we read or watched. But, keep in mind, civil scientific discourse is useful for the promotion of scientific discovery, especially in this open science movement. When we're having this replication of studies, it's important that we stay civil towards each other, especially when we're finding no findings, to previously individuals who found an effect based on some sort of treatment. It's just an extremely important thing. I think this is important for everyday life as well. Uncivil discourse really serves to harm the professionals and wreak havoc in the field. You may have read also that people. This is a career ruiner for individuals. So Amy Cuddy at some point felt like her career was ruined. So did other scientific researchers who had their studies replicated and were victims to this uncivil discourse of people, being, bullies to them. Whether or not it's been true or not, the point of the matter is it comes across that way. So the scientific critique needs to be conducted in a way that doesn't make people feel like that. And really, the APA and a few other kind of people or organizations have attempted to make clearer standards for how discourse should be handled in social psychology and other fields. Social psychology seems to be a little bit actually newer to the idea of scientific civil discourse than some of the other fields, such as biology or physics, along those fields. But we've really made an attempt to make it better. And to kind of conclude everything as well, just remember you have 2 readings for Thursday when we have our next lab, in which we're going to be reading Back to the 7 Deadly Sins of Psychology, which is by Chambers, chapter 6. That's page 126 to 148. And then also reading the Awad, Patel, and Riley article in 2016, in which we're going to talk about culturally sensitive research methods. And we'll actually have an assignment associated with that one as well. So make sure you read that.